They entered the courtroom ready to plead their case, hoping for a lighter punishment. But what unfolded next stunned everyone. These so-called killer kids didn't just stand before a judge. They were met with swift, unexpected justice right then and there. No warning, no chance to react. In an instant, the highly anticipated trial spiraled into something far more sinister. What you're about to witness are the moments when justice struck fast, faster than anyone could have imagined. Number 7. Frank DeLeon Jr. Teenage years are supposed to be a mix of awkward first loves, messy breakups, and big dreams about the future. Most teens are busy cramming for exams, plotting their college goals, or binge-watching Netflix while texting their crush. But every now and then, there are teenagers who take a much darker path. So dark that it snuffs out a life before it even has a chance to truly begin. This story is about one of those teenagers. Let's begin in Houston, Texas, where the brutal murder of a teenage girl led to a sentencing day that no one will ever forget. It was supposed to be just another peaceful evening in a quiet Houston neighborhood. 16-year-old Diamond Alvarez grabbed her dog's leash and headed out for a walk near her home. For her, this was routine, something normal, comforting even. But that night, someone was waiting for her. Someone she thought she knew. Diamond had been dating Frank DeLeon Jr., a boy with a temper that everyone around them was beginning to notice. Their relationship was rocky, typical of teenagers navigating young love, except this wasn't just about hurt feelings and late-night text arguments. Diamond had recently discovered Frank was cheating on her, and like any heartbroken teen, she wanted answers. That night, Frank texted her, asking to meet in a field near her house. Maybe she thought they were going to talk things out. Maybe she thought there was still a chance to salvage what they had. Instead, she walked straight into a nightmare. Neighbors later recalled hearing what sounded like fireworks in the distance. But it wasn't fireworks. It was the sound of 22 bullets being fired in rapid succession. Yes, 22 shots. Frank didn't just lash out in a single act of rage. This was cold, deliberate, calculated violence. Diamond's final moments were terrifying. She had no chance to run, no chance to scream for help. When the gunfire stopped, Diamond's lifeless body lay on the ground as her dog whined beside her. The person who found her wasn't a stranger. It was her mother. Imagine that for a moment. A parent racing toward the sound of gunfire, only to find their child lying there, gone. The grief and shock are almost too heavy to put into words. Frank, who was only 17 at the time, vanished into the night, leaving behind chaos and heartbreak. The investigation moved quickly. Evidence pointed straight to Frank, and soon he was in custody. Prosecutors were ready to take the case to trial, but there was a twist. Frank took a plea deal. Instead of facing a trial and potentially a harsher sentence, he agreed to 45 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 22.5 years. For Diamond's family, this felt like a betrayal. Their daughter's life was over forever, yet Frank could one day walk free. That verdict felt like salt rubbed deep into an open wound. Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg later released a statement, calling it a heartbreaking case of domestic violence and stressing the importance of raising awareness about the dangers of intimate partner violence, especially among young people. But no statement could prepare anyone for what would happen in court that October morning. The courtroom was packed on October 17, 2023. The atmosphere was so tense you could practically feel the air crackle. On one side sat Frank, calm and emotionless. flanked by his legal team. On the other side were Diamond's family and friends, their faces etched with pain and anger. When Diamond's mother, Ana Machado, took the stand to give her victim impact statement, her voice trembled as she described her daughter's final moments and the hole left in their family's lives. By the time she finished, emotions were running dangerously high. As Ana stepped down, she walked toward Frank. A bailiff quickly intercepted her, but the room was already on edge. Suddenly, Diamond's uncle lunged at Frank, breaking free from the crowd. Chaos erupted. Bailiffs tackled the uncle before he could reach Frank. But in the confusion, Frank's mother shoved Ana, igniting an all-out brawl. In seconds, the courtroom dissolved into a scene straight out of a movie. People screaming, family members rushing forward, security yelling commands. At one point, Frank's mother was thrown to the ground before deputies finally managed to regain control. The judge was visibly shaken, banging her gavel and demanding order, her voice barely audible over the shouting. Outside the courthouse, Ana faced reporters. Her anger was still there, simmering beneath her words, but so was guilt. "It was wrong of us," she admitted tearfully. "I apologize to the judge, I apologize to them, and I'm so sorry." This should never happen. Her statement showed just how raw and unhealed the wounds were. This wasn't just a case to her family. It was their entire world turned upside down. Frank DeLeon Jr. will spend decades behind bars, but the possibility of parole means Diamond's family may one day have to face him again. For them, there's no true justice. No prison sentence can bring Diamond back. And yet, that chaotic courtroom moment where grief and rage boiled over tells a bigger story. It's not just about one tragic night in Houston. It's about how violence ripples outward, shattering lives long after the final shot is fired. This was only the first of many cases where a courtroom, meant to deliver justice, became the scene of its own drama. And as shocking as this was, it pales in comparison to what happened in Salt Lake City, where a trial ended not with a sentence, but with a deadly gunshot inside the courtroom itself. Number 6. Siale Angilau. Courtrooms are supposed to be places of law and order, a little boring even. The kind of place where you hear the shuffle of papers, the occasional "Objection, Your Honor," and maybe a polite cough or two. But on April 21st, 2014, a federal courtroom in Salt Lake City became something very different. In a matter of seconds, it went from being a hall of justice to a place of chaos, fear, and sudden death. What should have been a routine day of testimony exploded into a moment so shocking that the courthouse itself had to be locked down. And at the very center of it all was a young man named Siale Angilau, who made one final desperate move that would cost him his life. Siale Angilau wasn't just any defendant. He was 25 years old, a reputed member of the Tongan Crip gang, a violent street gang based in Salt Lake City, with deep ties to drug trafficking, assaults, and shootings. The trial itself was part of a major federal crackdown on the gang, with prosecutors working for years to dismantle the organization from the inside out. Now, here's the problem with gang cases. Loyalty runs deep, and betrayal runs even deeper. Prosecutors had lined up cooperating witnesses, former gang members who had flipped, ready to testify against their old friends and brothers. This wasn't just about legal testimony. In gang culture, testifying against someone is the ultimate act of treachery, a literal death sentence. That courtroom was buzzing with tension, even before anyone said a word. Families of gang members sat on one side, whispering nervously. Federal agents sat on the other, watchful and stone-faced. Everyone knew the stakes were dangerously high. As the judge entered and the trial began, there was this unspoken awareness in the room. One wrong word, one wrong move, and everything could spiral out of control. And then it did. The witness was on the stand, testifying about gang activity when it happened. According to later released transcripts and chilling courtroom footage, Siale Angilau suddenly rose from his seat at the defense table. No hesitation, no warning. He snatched a pen from the counsel's area and charged forward. The witness's eyes widening in terror as a 6-foot-plus man lunges straight at him. In those few heartbeats, everyone in the room realized what was about to happen. But only one person had the authority and the speed to act. A United States Marshal, identified only in court records as Jane Doe, made an instant life-or-death decision. She drew her firearm and fired 4 shots in rapid succession. The sound of gunfire echoed through the courtroom, a place where the loudest noise moments earlier had been the click of a gavel. Siale Angilau stumbled and collapsed, bleeding on the floor, just feet from the witness he had been trying to attack. Panic swept through the room. Jurors screamed and dove under benches. Spectators hit the ground or fled toward the exits. Marshals stood with weapons drawn, shouting commands. The judge immediately called a recess, her voice trembling as she tried to restore order. Outside, the entire federal courthouse was locked down for hours, surrounded by yellow police tape and heavily armed officers. Siale was rushed to a nearby hospital, but by that afternoon, he was pronounced dead. Why would a man risk his life in front of a federal jury, his family and officers armed to the teeth? The answer lies in gang culture. In that world, attacking a snitch isn't just revenge, it's a statement. By lunging at the witness, Siale may have been trying to send a message to everyone watching that loyalty to the gang runs deeper than life itself, and betrayal will never go unpunished. The shooting sparked intense debate. Was it justified? Most legal experts said yes. The marshal acted to protect a life. That day, a federal courtroom became something no one ever expected: a crime scene. And while the trial went on without him, the moment served as a chilling warning. Even in the halls of justice, violence can strike in the blink of an eye. While the honor amongst gangs might have driven Siale to his grave, just a few years later, a far less consequential teenage dispute spiraled into tragedy. Number 5. Victor Nathan Rivas. Teenagers fight over the dumbest things sometimes. Who's dating who took the last slice of pizza, or who left the group chat without saying goodbye. Usually, these squabbles end with some sulking, a few nasty texts, and maybe some awkward silence at school the next day. But in this case, a teenage argument didn't just end badly. It ended in bloodshed. On May 16, 2022, the quiet calm of a West Side San Antonio neighborhood was shattered by the sound of gunfire. When the shots finally stopped, 15-year-old Ethan Soto lay dying on the pavement. The reason? Not a gang war, not a robbery gone wrong, but stolen THC cartridges. That's right. Something so small, so pathetically trivial, sparked a chain of events that destroyed multiple families and shook an entire community. Here's how it all went down. Ethan was a typical 15-year-old, a kid with friends, family, and a life ahead of him. But he got caught up in a bitter feud with another teenager, 16-year-old Victor Nathaniel Rivas, over THC cartridges. What should have been nothing more than some teenage trash talk and maybe a schoolyard fight escalated into something far darker. Investigators would later say this wasn't some random act of violence. It was planned. Ethan was allegedly lured into a spot under false pretenses, what seemed like just a meeting to settle things. But it was a setup, a deadly ambush. Neighbors later recalled hearing shouting, then gunshots that rang out like firecrackers in the night. When they rushed outside, they saw Ethan lying on the ground, bleeding. His killer was already gone. One neighbor told reporters, "It didn't seem real. You never think something like this is going to happen right here, right outside your house." For Ethan's family, their worst nightmare had just become reality. If the name Soto sounds familiar, there's a heartbreaking reason. Ethan was the younger brother of Savannah Soto, a pregnant teenager whose murder during a drug deal gone wrong in 2023 made national headlines. Two children from the same family, both taken by senseless violence within 2 years. Imagine the grief and anger simmering in that household. Ethan's death wasn't just a tragedy, it felt like a curse. It didn't take long for police to zero in on Victor Nathaniel Rivas. Witness statements and evidence pointed straight to him as the orchestrator of the ambush. By the time he was arrested, the community was already seething. Rivas was charged with murder, and at just 16, he was now staring down a future that would likely unfold entirely behind prison walls. The stage was set for a high-stakes courtroom showdown. Fast forward to October 2023. Rivas was now 18 and sitting in a Baydar County courtroom for a preliminary hearing. The room was packed. Ethan's family, friends, and community members filled the gallery, all of them hungry for justice, or at least answers. The atmosphere was electric, tense, like the air before a thunderstorm. And then, in a single moment, everything exploded. According to deputies and footage later shared online, Rivas made a gesture toward Ethan's grieving family. To this day, no one is quite sure what exactly he did. Maybe it was careless, maybe it was meant to provoke. But whatever it was like throwing a lit match into a pool of gasoline. Almost instantly, Ethan's relatives jumped over the courtroom railing and rushed Rivas. It was total chaos. Video of the melee quickly went viral. By the time order was restored, Rivas had a visible facial injury and was treated by paramedics right there in the courthouse. 4 individuals were arrested for assault and disrupting court proceedings, including 2 juveniles. For Ethan's family, seeing Rivas sitting there in that courtroom was already painful enough. The gesture, whatever it truly meant, was like rubbing salt into a wound that was still raw and bleeding. In that moment, grief turned to rage. Logic went out the window. But the aftermath only added another layer of heartbreak. Instead of focusing solely on Ethan's case, the family now faced their own legal troubles because of the fight. Number 4. David Paradiso. On January 24, 2007, inside a California courtroom, all sense of order was ripped apart. What should have been another day of testimony turned into a scene of chaos, bloodshed, and disbelief, leaving families screaming, attorneys diving for cover, and a judge bleeding as her courtroom descended into absolute mayhem. And at the center of it all was David Paradiso, a man who walked into that courthouse accused of murder and never walked out again. Before that day, the name David Paradiso was already infamous in Stanislaus County, California. He wasn't just some random defendant. Paradiso was on trial for the brutal murder of his girlfriend, a case that had gripped the local community. It wasn't just the horror of the crime that got people talking. It was him. People whispered about Paradiso in hallways and coffee shops, saying he's unpredictable, explosive, and a ticking time bomb just waiting to go off. Friends of the victim described his violent temper. his jealous streak, and his controlling behavior. Even in court, he carried an air of barely contained rage. Everyone knew this was going to be a tense trial, but no one could have predicted how dangerously tense it would become. It was supposed to be just another routine day in court. Witnesses testified, attorneys cross-examined, and Judge Cinder Fox presided from the bench. During a quiet break in the trial, there was no sign of the chaos that was about to erupt. Then, without warning, Paradiso snapped. In a split second, he bolted from his seat. But instead of lunging toward the prosecutor or the bailiffs like everyone might have expected, he went straight for the judge. Yes, you read that right. David Paradiso charged at Judge Fox herself. And here's where it gets chilling. His family later revealed they had warned deputies beforehand, fearing he'd somehow managed to hide a weapon. Despite routine security checks, they believed he'd smuggled something dangerous into the courtroom. Turns out, they were right. Paradiso slipped behind the judge's bench, brandishing what appeared to be a hidden blade. Judge Fox was struck in the chaos, wounded and bleeding, before deputies managed to pull her to safety. Even as she was rushed out on a stretcher, she somehow managed to assure reporters later, "I'm okay." But at that moment, inside that courtroom, no one was okay. As Paradiso raised his weapon again, ready to unleash even more violence, Detective Eric Bradley made a split-second decision. He drew his gun. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. One shot, then another. Paradiso collapsed to the floor, the weapon clattering beside him. Blood pooled across the polished wood, a grotesque reminder of how quickly justice had turned deadly. Just like that, the trial was over. Not with a verdict, but with death. The courthouse went into immediate lockdown. Yellow tape went up, armed guards flooded the building, and investigators swarmed the scene. Everyone wanted answers, but none got any. For the families in attendance, the trauma was unbearable. The incident sparked heated debates about courtroom safety. If a defendant could smuggle in a weapon and attack a judge in broad daylight, what did that say about the system's ability to protect victims, witnesses, and court staff? Security protocols were reviewed and tightened across California in the weeks that followed. But the haunting image of that day lingered like a bad dream. From California to South Carolina, grief and anger often collide. And sometimes, even a plea deal isn't enough to calm a family's fury. Number 3. Lindy Lamont Jones Jr. On July 14, 2022 in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, justice felt like it was slipping through everyone's fingers in the courtroom. The room was packed, grieving family members on one side, stone-faced lawyers on the other, and at the very center, Lindy Lamont Jones Jr., a teenager already branded a killer. The air was so heavy with tension you could almost taste it. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the sentencing to begin. But what no one realized was that this wasn't going to be a quiet, orderly day in court. It was going to explode. To understand the chaos that followed, you have to go back to August 2nd, 2019. 18-year-old Willie Antoine Fields was just starting his adult life when everything was cut short. That night, his body was found dumped on a rural country road, riddled with bullets. It was a brutal, senseless killing that shocked the local community. As investigators began piecing the case together, one name kept surfacing: Lindy Lamont Jones Jr. Jones was only 19 at the time, and prosecutors claimed the murder stemmed from nothing more than a petty dispute. A pointless conflict that escalated into unthinkable violence. The Fields family's lives were shattered. A young life had been erased. And for what? Some trivial disagreement no one would even remember a year later. Fast forward 3 years to the courthouse in Orangeburg County. Jones, now older, but still looking more like a kid than a hardened criminal, stood shackled before the judge. Instead of going through a long, grueling trial, Jones had struck a plea deal with prosecutors. His sentence? 35 years in prison. On paper, 35 years sounds like a long time. But for the Fields family, it felt like a slap in the face. Willie's life was gone forever. Meanwhile, his killer would one day walk free. To them, this wasn't justice. It was a bargain struck at the expense of their son's memory. The room went silent as Angela Fields, Willie's mother, was given the chance to speak. Her words were trembling, raw, soaked in grief. She spoke about her son, the day she found out he'd been murdered, the heartbreak of seeing his body, the cruel reality of trying to call his phone and remembering he'd never pick up again. Every sentence cut deeper into the wound this family had been carrying for years. The courtroom was drowning in sorrow. But grief doesn't always stay quiet. Sometimes it erupts into rage. As Angela spoke, her husband, Willie Clay Fields, sat just feet away, listening. His fists clenched, his face twisted with pain. And then it happened. In one sudden, violent moment, Willie Clay snapped. He lunged forward, sprinting past a sheriff's deputy like a man possessed. Before anyone could react, he tackled Lindy Lamont Jones Jr., his fists crashing into the young man's face. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Deputies dove in, wrestling Willie Clay to the ground. The judge slammed his gavel, shouting for order. People screamed and scattered, some crying, others yelling in shock. Jones himself was dragged back by bailiffs, his face bloodied, his shackles clanging against the floor. For a split second, it felt like the entire courtroom had turned into a battlefield. Once deputies managed to regain control, Willie Clay Fields was arrested and charged with contempt of court and assault and battery. His attorney, Justin Bamberg, immediately came to his defense. In a public statement, Bamberg said, "No father should have to bury his innocent son. Mr. Fields is not a criminal. He is a victim of the senseless violence that occurs far too often in our communities. Justice in this case demands setting Mr. Fields free from these charges so that he may mourn in peace." Supporters quickly rallied behind Willie Clay, even starting the hashtag #FreePops, turning his emotional outburst into a larger conversation about grief and justice. Jones ultimately received his 35-year sentence, but that day will never be remembered for the punishment he got. It will be remembered for the raw, unfiltered grief that ripped through the courthouse and shattered the illusion of order. For the Fields family, justice will never truly exist. For Jones, prison time will never undo what he did. And for everyone who witnessed it, that day was a stark reminder of just how deeply violence scars not only its direct victims, but entire families and communities. But the next case wasn't just about anger. It was about pure hatred and the haunting weight of a racially motivated massacre. Number 2. Payton Gendron. February 15, 2023. A cold, gray morning in Buffalo, New York. Inside a packed courtroom, you could almost feel the tension pressing down like a heavy storm cloud. All eyes were fixed on one figure, 18-year-old Payton Gendron. To many, he wasn't just a defendant. He was the supermarket shooter, the teenager who had transformed an ordinary Saturday afternoon of grocery shopping into a nightmare of blood, chaos, and unthinkable loss. This wasn't just a sentencing hearing. No, this felt like Judgment Day, and sitting just a few feet away were the families of his victims. 10 innocent black lives gone forever. Parents, grandparents, siblings, and children were now forced to face the very person who had ripped their world apart. Imagine that moment, the air so thick with grief and anger that it was almost suffocating. One by one, relatives stood to speak. Their voices trembled as they described the void left behind. Some shouted in pain, others whispered through tears. Each word was like a blade cutting into the silence. Meanwhile, Gendron stood there pale, shaking slightly, almost robotic. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He barely even blinked. And then, it happened. As one grieving family member spoke, his pain turned to pure rage. In a sudden explosion of emotion, he lunged across the courtroom, charging straight at Gendron. Gasps filled the air. Chairs toppled over. Before he could reach the teen, deputies rushed in, tackling him to the ground. The room erupted into chaos, screams, shouts, people crying out for justice. For a split second, it felt like the entire trial might spiral completely out of control. But to truly understand the fury in that room, you need to know what brought everyone there in the first place. On May 14, 2022, a sunny afternoon turned into horror. Payton Gendron drove hours to Buffalo, targeting Tops Friendly Market, a grocery store in the heart of a predominantly black neighborhood, to commit an act of hate-fueled domestic terrorism. He wasn't acting on a whim. Gendron had been planning this attack for months. Investigators later discovered he had visited the store multiple times, mapping out the layout, counting the number of black and white shoppers, and even writing a chilling manifesto filled with white supremacist conspiracy theories like the so-called Great Replacement theory. When he finally struck, he came prepared. Tactical gear, a helmet-mounted camera to live-stream the carnage, and an assault rifle. In a matter of minutes, 10 innocent people were dead. Among them were a retired police officer who tried to stop him, a loving grandmother shopping for Sunday dinner, and a taxi driver who was known for his kindness. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, gone in an instant because of hate. Fast forward to February 15th, 2023. This was the first time many of the victims' families had been in the same room as Gendron. The prosecution laid out the devastation he caused, while families took turns giving emotional victim impact statements. It wasn't just about telling their stories. It was about reclaiming some small piece of power from the man who had stolen so much from them. Then came Gendron's so-called apology. If you were expecting tears or remorse, think again. His words were flat, cold, mechanical, like he was reading from a script. It only deepened the family's pain, a reminder that no sentence could ever undo what he'd done. The judge didn't hesitate. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even that wasn't the end. Federal prosecutors stepped in, pushing for the death penalty. Under Attorney General Merrick Garland, Gendron became one of the first domestic terrorists in recent years to face that ultimate punishment. A signal that this wasn't just a local crime. This was an act of terror against the entire nation. What makes this case even more chilling is how someone so young could commit such unimaginable violence. Gendron's journey into hate didn't happen overnight. He was radicalized online, spending countless hours in the darkest corners of the internet, where racism and conspiracy theories run rampant. Each post, each video, each toxic idea fed his growing obsession until it consumed him completely. By the time he drove to Buffalo, he wasn't just a teenager anymore. He had turned himself into a weapon. Number 1. Brisbane Supreme Court stabbing. Inside the Supreme Court on March 31st, 2025, in Brisbane, Australia, the mood was tense but controlled, at least for a while. It was supposed to be a routine sentencing day. Lawyers shuffled papers, the judge prepared to hand down a decision, and the family of a murder victim sat quietly in the gallery, clutching tissues and each other's hands. But here's the thing about grief. It doesn't follow the rules. And on that day, it didn't just break the silence, it shattered it. As everyone waited for the sentencing to begin, a 22-year-old man, the victim's older brother, rose slowly to his feet. To most in the room, it seemed like a small, almost unremarkable movement. But within seconds, it became clear this wasn't going to be ordinary. In a flash, he snatched a simple pen from a solicitor's desk and lunged at the teenage killer sitting just meters away. Think about that for a second. A pen, something so ordinary, so harmless, suddenly transformed into a weapon of rage. Before anyone could react, the sharp tip drove into the teen's back, leaving a small injury but triggering something far more violent. Absolute chaos. The moment the attack happened, the courtroom erupted. Family members screamed. Some collapsed to the ground in anguish. Security officers sprinted forward as people scattered in every direction. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, but it was like yelling into a storm. Police officers poured in, wrestling the attacker to the ground as he kicked and shouted. And all the while, the teenage offender, the very reason they were there, sat stunned, bleeding slightly, and surrounded by a wall of guards. Outside, the chaos continued. Paramedics rushed to help an elderly family member who had collapsed from the shock. Dozens of police, including detectives, scrambled to contain the scene as tensions boiled over. It took 20 minutes, 20 long, tense minutes, for order to finally return. To really understand why this young man snapped, you need to go back to May 2024. That's when 19-year-old Abdullahi Ahmed Yao was fatally stabbed in the suburb of Acacia Ridge. Police found him lying in the street, covered in blood, with stab wounds to his leg, lower abdomen, and stomach. A hunting knife, the weapon used in the attack, was discovered nearby. Yao was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but after weeks of battling for his life, complications like sepsis ultimately claimed him. The teenage killer, who was known to Yao, was arrested near the scene almost immediately. At just 17, he had no prior criminal history, but the brutality of the attack shocked the community. By December 2024, he had pleaded guilty to murder, threatening violence toward a woman, and even refusing to comply with a police order about his phone and other devices. For nearly a year, Abdullahi's family endured court dates, delays, and painful reminders of the night they lost him. By the time sentencing day arrived, emotions were stretched to the breaking point. So, when the victim's family finally came face to face with the teenage killer, sitting calmly in the dock as if nothing had happened, the thin line between grief and rage snapped. The victim's sister had told police just days earlier that it felt unfair that her brother's killer was walking around while my brother is dead. Her pain echoed the thoughts of the entire family, who had waited months for justice. And then her older brother acted. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't planned. It was a moment of pure, uncontrollable emotion. But actions have consequences. The judge immediately cleared the courtroom and later declared a mistrial, throwing yet another wrench into an already painful process. The 22-year-old attacker was arrested on the spot, charged with assault occasioning bodily harm, while armed and making threats. He was remanded to face his own court hearing in the coming weeks. Imagine that for a second. One family already destroyed by a stabbing is now facing the possibility of losing another son to prison, not for murder, but for an act of grief-fueled violence committed in the very place meant to deliver justice. Outside the courthouse, emotions remained raw. Some family members wailed and threw themselves to the ground. Others stood silent, their faces hardened by anger and loss. The attack sparked immediate debate across Brisbane. Some argued the brothers' actions were understandable. After all, how can anyone truly stay calm when staring into the eyes of their loved one's killer? Others worried it set a dangerous precedent, showing what happens when emotion takes control inside a courtroom meant to uphold the law. The community was left wrestling with. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.